evening to everyone who is there. I've seen a number of familiar names, so it's very nice to see that. Yes, so my topic today, as Ajay already mentioned, is Guardians of the Coast, Tamil Nadu's Muslim Maritime Legacy. And I have now been involved for almost 30 years in researching this history, this very rich history. And again and again have to realize that when I talk to people, many people are really unfamiliar with the idea even that there is a larger Muslim community in Tamil Nadu that has this very rich history. So talks like these also give me a little bit of an opportunity to try to bring many, many different things together that I've myself done in the past and that a group of others, very important scholars, have been contributing to in the last few decades. And I hope that this will be of some interest to you and your audience. Now, when we think of the state of Tamil Nadu, the usual images that come in mind for most people are images of large temples, of a rich ritual, Hindu ritual culture, and of, by and large, a state that is probably as Hindu as you could imagine. That is also something that you find expressed in a sense by the state seal of Tamil Nadu, which shows this large gopuram. But it is also the common sort of idea that many people approach Tamil Nadu with when they go to Tamil Nadu, what they expect to see in the state. And it is far less well known that there is a very rich history of Muslims settling in the state, living in the state, and contributing to its history. So in many ways, Muslims in Tamil Nadu constitute what I would call an overlooked community. The state is not often associated with Muslims, and Muslims admittedly form a relatively small part of the population of Tamil Nadu, just about 5.5% of the total population. On top of that, and this is another thing that's very important when we speak about Muslims in Tamil Nadu, is that despite the fact that we are talking about a relatively small community, on top of that, that community is yet again divided by language, by different religious practices, and by different cultural practices. So actually to speak simply of Muslims in Tamil Nadu hides more than is actually the case, because depending on where you are in Tamil Nadu, which town you are, the Muslim culture of that area may differ tremendously. Finally, Tamil Muslims, and especially those who speak Tamil, are in many cases not what I would call readable by the general perceptions that we have when we speak about Islam in India. So there is a strong integration of Tamil Muslims into the local society, which expresses itself in quite a number of things. So in terms of aesthetics, and you will come to see this later in the talk several times, in contrast to what we come to expect with, when we talk about Muslims in India, which is what I would call a very Mughlai kind of imagination of aesthetics and the way buildings are supposed to look, clothes are imagined, and so on and so forth. The local aesthetics of Tamil Muslims are far more integrated into the wider aesthetic landscape of the state. Neither Persian nor Urdu have had any very important historical role amongst Tamil Muslims in history. And that is another thing which sort of separates the local Tamil-speaking community from an existing community of Urdu-speaking Muslims. When you actually look at the map that you see in this slide on the left-hand side, which is the share of Muslims in the taluks or tehsils of Tamil Nadu in the year 2011, you can also see that the distribution of Muslims in the state is highly variable. And you immediately see that there is one area which starts here in the Kaveri Delta and then in a sense goes down all the way to Kanyakumari, stands out as having a far greater percentage of Muslims than many of the places inland Tamil Nadu. So you can already see that depending where you are in Tamil Nadu, also the chances of encountering part of this Muslim heritage are different. And on top of that, as mentioned, you have these differences within the community. So for example, you see that here in the extreme north, you have a relatively large concentration of Muslims. These are Muslims mostly who are Urdu speakers, who are connected to the court of the Nawabs of our court. And they can be very different in culture and many other practices from Muslims who live, say, here along the coast or closer to Kanyakumari. Now, as you can already also guess a little bit from this map, because you can see that tendentially the percentage of Muslims goes up the closer you come to the coast, that there is a very close connection in the history between Tamil Nadu Muslims and the sea. So Muslims have been very, very important in the maritime history of Tamil Nadu. And this means they have been very important actually in the maritime history of India as a whole. For Tamil Nadu has been one of the states, perhaps together with Kerala and Gujarat, that have played the greatest role in Indian transoceanic maritime connections. And this is basically the story I want to talk about today. So in order to do that, however, we have to very briefly talk about how Islam actually came to be in Tamil Nadu. What is the history of Islam in Tamil Nadu? And that history is actually surprisingly long and surprisingly complex. As mentioned, Muslims have played a very important role, especially for the economy of Tamil Nadu and for the maritime connections. And they are very closely connected to Tamil-speaking Muslim communities outside of India. One of them are the Moors, the Ceylon Moors in Sri Lanka. That is basically the Muslims of Sri Lanka, the majority of whom are also Tamil-speaking. And then there is a large diaspora of, or large, but large by the standards of the community, of Tamil-speaking Muslims in Malaysia, in Singapore, as well as in a couple of other Southeast Asian countries, such as Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, etc. And what really characterizes these Tamil-speaking Muslims is actually the adoption of the Tamil language and also the adoption of a very clear and distinct Tamil identity in the course of their history. Now, in order to understand how Islam came to Tamil Nadu, we have to understand that there were basically two very different processes at hand in the transmission of Islam to the Tamil country. Basically, we can divide that transmission into two streams. One is a maritime transmission via the maritime trade routes across the Arabian Sea, mostly from southern Arabia, especially Yemen, and from the Gulf region of the Middle East. And the other path is then through North India and from North India further on to Persia, Central Asia, which then starts predominantly when the Delhi Sultanate starts expanding in the late 13th century into South India. Now, these two paths by which Islam reached Tamil Nadu has led to an important element within those differences in the Tamil Muslim community that I have earlier described. So they have led to differences in settlement. As you can imagine, the one side, we have Muslims settled along the coast and especially in the south of Tamil Nadu who had very close connections with the Middle East across the ocean. And then on the other hand, those Muslims who are settled further inland or more in the north of Tamil Nadu tendentially have had more connections to northern India and to the Muslim communities there. This has also led to a difference within the religion, and that is within the law school that Tamil Sunni Muslims follow. And the vast majority of Tamil Muslims actually are Sunni Muslims, right? But those who live along the coast, who have this closer connection with the transoceanic trade routes, they tend to follow the Shafi'i school of law. And the Shafi'i school of law within India is mostly limited to areas along the coast. So Kerala is, of course, the best example of a Muslim community that is predominantly Shafi'i. We have a few Shafi'i communities along the west coast, also on the Konkan coast. But the Shafi'i law school is far more widespread in the Middle East, and especially in Yemen on the one hand side, and then also on the other side in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in parts of Southeast Asia. So the Shafi'i school really shows these transoceanic connections, whereas those Muslims who have a closer connection to North India, they generally tend to follow the Hanafi law school. That is the same law school that you find in other parts of India, most of northern India, and then also in places like Turkey or Central Asia. And finally, of course, there's a difference in the economy. Mostly the coastal economy is directly connected to this maritime trade and to trade along India's coasts, whereas the people settled further inland are more commonly employed in smaller localized trade in shopkeeping or in certain artisan and historically handicraft productions, such as, for example, in weaving. So there's a couple of communities in inland Tamil Nadu who historically have been connected to the production of cotton cloth that was then brought to the coasts and exported from the coasts mostly to Southeast Asia. Now, when does all of this begin? When do we find the first evidence for connections between the Muslim world on the one side and Tamil Nadu? We have to keep in mind that there is a long-standing historical contact between South India and the Middle East. And some of you may remember a few months ago, this was something that went across social media, that in the Valley of Kings in Egypt, people have found inscriptions, graffiti made by Indian travelers, probably in the Roman period, who visited those tombs and inscribed their names on the tomb walls. And there were a couple of Indian travelers who wrote in Brahmi script on these tomb walls. Some of them are in Prakrit, but there were also a couple of Tamil inscriptions there. And we have found other Tamil inscriptions in Roman Egypt. So there is a long-standing connection between South India and the Middle East in trade that long predates actually the emergence of Islam. And you can see this in the way that in Tamil, Muslims have been labeled historically as Sonagar, which is basically the same as the Sanskrit word Yavan or Jonaka you have in Prakrit. That is where the Tamil word is derived from, which originally meant Greeks or Ionians, but came to be applied to just everyone who came from Western Asia. So really, in a sense, it's not as if there was any moment of discovery between Tamil Nadu and this Middle Eastern world. It is simply that Islam emerged into a Middle East that was already in close contacts with South India. And this only increased with time through the so-called monsoon trade, through the trade between the Middle East and South India, which is sometimes also referred to as the Silk Route of the Sea or the Spice Route, where really what is important for us, what was being traded from the Middle East to India at one point were horses. This was, I will come back to this, in a sense, the most important trade good that Arab and Iranian merchants brought to South India. And in return, they would take spices, they would take also East Asian goods that had been brought from China or from Southeast Asia to India, and that would be traded in India for these goods which were brought by these Middle Eastern traders. And you can just very briefly to point this out here on the image that you see, this is a manuscript from the early 14th century of an Arab geographer's text, which was written in the 12th century. And you see this is a map, and you have to imagine it, it's basically south is on top. So you have to turn it around. The big island that you see in the center, that is basically Sri Lanka. And what you see coming up here, this is the tip of India. So by the 12th, 13th century, we get a lot of description of also the West Coast had been on, so to say, the radar of Arab geographers for a while. But increasingly, we also get descriptions of Ceylon, and we get descriptions of the lowest part, the southernmost part of the East Coast, basically what is nowadays Tamil Nadu. And this region was called in Arabic as Ma'bar. Ma'bar basically means something like a crossing point or a ford. Don't confuse it with Malabar, right? These are two totally different names. And even today, people regularly tend to confuse it because Malabar has become a fairly widely known term, whereas Ma'bar is generally not very widely known. But Ma'bar is not the same as Malabar. There's a very clear statement in most geographies where the border between the two areas is. And that is the city of Kollam in southern Kerala. So basically then what is left of the West Coast, Very much like today, the southernmost part of the west coast is within Tamil Nadu, and the southernmost part of the west coast at that time was considered to be part of this country of Malabar, and then it continues on the east coast. And it is called Malabar because it is the place where you would cross India in order to get from the Arabian Sea area into the Bay of Bengal area. So not everyone, not every trader who wanted to trade in Chinese goods, for example, would go all the way to China. They would come to the west coast of India. And some other traders would bring these Chinese goods to the east coast, and then they would be transported overland into a port on the west coast. And that is why this country was referred to as the crossing point from the western part of the Indian Ocean into the eastern area of the Indian. Now, for this region, we have a clear presence of Muslims starting in Sri Lanka, perhaps around the 9th century of the Common Era. In Tamil Nadu, clear evidence is a little bit later, maybe from the 11th century. That is actually the period of the height of power of the Chola Empire. And indeed, some of the earliest clear evidence for the presence of Muslims in Tamil Nadu comes from a very surprising source via the Cholas. And this source are the annals of the Sung dynasty in China, which actually records that in the years 1015 and in 1033, embassies came from the Chola Empire to China. And the people who led these embassies were actually Muslims. So this is one of the earliest evidences for the presence of Muslims within the Chola heartland, so to speak. Now, when you ask other people, and if you search a bit on the net, you will find a lot of stories about how there's evidence that makes the presence of Muslims even older in that area. And I'm not going to dispute that evidence, but I'm only going to say that this evidence in many cases comes with question marks. So it may well be that in the not too far future, we will find much better evidence for the presence of Muslims in Tamil Nadu already before the 11th century. But at the current moment, a conservative, safe sort of estimate is that by the 11th century, there definitely were traders from Muslim traders from the Middle East settled in some way or the other in Tamil Nadu. Another thing that happens and that we can trace to at least the 10th century of the Common Era is pilgrimages that were going to the Shripada, to Adam's Peak, that is the tallest mountain of Sri Lanka. And in Christian and Muslim lore, this mountain supposedly is the place where Adam, when he was cast out of paradise, Adam and Eve, when they were thrown out of paradise, they landed on earth on that mountain. And we can see already in the 10th century CE that people from the Middle East would take pilgrimages to Sri Lanka to reach that mountain. And in the course, they also would call at South Indian ports and would increase the knowledge that people in the Middle East had about South India and vice versa. A little bit later, by the 13th century, we can see that Muslims now had a very, very important role already to play in local kingdoms. And the kingdom most important here is the Pandya kingdom centered in Madurai in the 13th century. So we know from histories written in Iran, actually, that in the 13th century or the beginning of the 14th century, the Pandya kings had actually given the revenues, the customs revenues of their most important ports to a prince from the royal house of the island of Kish in the Persian Gulf. And that was basically in exchange for the Kish merchants to transport horses from the Middle East to the Pandya kingdom, because the Pandyas needed horses. The horse was at that time the prime element of warfare. It was like the battle tank in a sense of those days. And in order to be able to defend themselves against their enemies, the Pandyas needed these horses. So they apparently maintained very good connections to the Middle East through these horse traders. Another evidence that we have comes from Yemen, and that is that traditionally during the Friday prayers, the name of the ruler was to be pronounced from the pulpit of the mosque, and the ruler was to be blessed. Now, this could only be done, of course, if you had a Muslim ruler. So Muslims living in non-Muslim areas were, in a sense, open for grabs by Muslim rulers elsewhere. And we know that the sultans of Yemen at that time they actually paid stipends to a number of port cities in India to have the Friday prayers read in their names. And among these port cities that are mentioned in these stipends, we not only have a couple of places along the west coast, including what seems to be places in contemporary Mumbai, but we also have a couple of towns on the east coast in what is now Tamil Nadu. So again, we can see how there is a very close connection between the Pandya kings on the one side and both the Gulf region and Yemen on the other side. And this, interestingly enough, also towards the east extends towards China, where, interestingly enough, that same information we have in the Persian histories from Iran, that the Pandyas had given their revenues to these people from Kish, that is also found in Chinese historiography. So we can actually link up a big connection between parts of the Middle East, the Pandya kingdom, and China in this period. Now, there's another very important thing that then happens in the 13th century, and that is that finally the Delhi Sultanate sort of appears on the local map. From the very end of the 13th century onwards, the Delhi Sultanate starts invading parts of South India, in the beginning predominantly for plunder. And here we have the famous Malik Kafur to mention, who is probably the first general of the Delhi Sultanate to reach what is now Tamil Nadu. By the 1320s, then, Tamil Nadu actually, or the Pandya kingdom actually gets conquered by the Delhi Sultanate. And interestingly enough, this leads to conflicts between the Delhi Sultanate as conquerors and locally settled Muslims. So this is actually reported by Amir Khusro that there were Muslims in the Pandya kingdom who were allied to the Pandyas and who were fighting the incoming Delhi Sultanate. And as you can imagine, Amir Khusro was not particularly happy about this fact. Ultimately, this ended in the conquest of much of northern and central Tamil Nadu by the Delhi Sultanate. But as you can imagine, this is so far from Delhi that the Delhi Sultanate was not really able to hold on to that area. And already in 1334, that's just a few years after the conquest, the local grantees and the local administrators rebelled against the Delhi Sultanate under a man called Jalaluddin Ahsan Shah, whose coin you see on the left-hand side. And they established a short-lived sultanate with the capital in Madurai called the Sultanate of Mabar, or sometimes also the Madurai Sultanate. We don't know much about this sultanate because they didn't, if they wrote ever anything on their own, it hasn't really survived. So most of the information we have about this sultanate comes either from their enemies or it comes from the evidence of coins. But till 1378, this sultanate existed and was then conquered by the Vijayanagara kingdom. Now, the successor states of the Delhi Sultanate in the Deccan, both the Hindu successor states like Vijayanagara and the Muslim ones, came to heavily rely also on Muslim soldiers and Muslim administrators, so thereby adding a wholly new layer to the history of Islam in the region. And this was then slowly over time integrated into local structures. Now, the rise of Vijayanagara and the conquest of most of what is now Tamil Nadu by the Vijayanagara Empire leads to a very, very interesting development where the Muslims settled in Tamil Nadu start turning away from their connections with the West, with the Middle East, and start turning towards the East, towards Southeast Asia and China. And one of the main reasons for that is that the main thing that brought Middle Eastern traders to Tamil Nadu in the beginning, namely the trade in horses, Vijayanagara doesn't need to trade horses through these East Coast ports. And that is because they control ports on the West Coast. So a port like Bhatkal, for example, in Karnataka, that port rises in the Vijayanagara period very much because trade that earlier had gone to the Pandya country would now come to a port like Bhatkal. Whereas the Muslims who were already on the Tamil coast were looking for new markets. And that meant increased trade both with Southeast Asia and with China. And something that apparently seems to have happened in this period, I will give you some evidence for that in a moment, is that communities of traders, of Tamil traders on the coast who were till then predominantly Buddhist, seem to have converted to Islam. So in a sense, much of the Islamic maritime trade from the late 14th, 15th century onwards rests on this Buddhist community that then converts to Islam. And they convert to Islam because most of their trading partners in Southeast Asia, in Sumatra, in many parts of what is now Indonesia, have by that time converted to Islam. So they, in a sense, follow and become Muslims themselves. And this leads to what I would say is the classic period of Islam in Tamil Nadu, and to a very rich trade, usually in South Indian cotton and South Indian cotton cloth for Southeast Asian goods such as camphor, betel nuts, or elephants. And this trade really goes on pretty much uninterrupted till more or less the early 19th century. Another thing that happens as a result of this shift from west to east, and which is also very, very important, is a sort of, you might call it a provincialization of the local Muslim community, because you are not constantly anymore going back and forth between the Middle East. The local community starts Tamilizing. And of course, much of this is then augmented by the fact that people intermarry, by the fact that we may have had these conversions of other trading communities along the coast. So more and more, you can tell that Muslims sort of integrate not only economically, but linguistically along the coastline. And you can see that, for example, in this tombstone from Kiakarai, which is dated to 1513, but on that same graveyard, you have a lot of tombstones that are even older, that come from the mid-15th century. And you can see, very unusual for a Muslim tombstone, this tombstone is completely engraved in Tamil. The inscription is completely in Tamil language. And it records, in this case, the individual buried there is a lady whose Muslim identity we can only guess because she is called Mrs. Hussein Nachyar, the daughter of a man called Vavu Martanda Marakar. And this title Marakar, people who know Tamil Nadu will know Marakar is usually indicative of a person being a Muslim. But you can see to the degree to which these people were really locals, using the local language and local ways of naming and dating in order to identify themselves. Now, one very important symbol for all of this is a place on the coast of the Kaveri Delta known as Nagur, and especially the Dargah, which is located in Nagur, which is the largest Dargah in Tamil Nadu. Nagur is more or less a suburb of the town of Nagapatnam. And Nagapatnam is historically one of the most important ports along the Kaveri Delta coast, so one of the most important ports also under the rule of the Cholas. And it is one of the sites in Tamil Nadu which has the strongest connections actually to Buddhism. So the saint buried in the Nagur Dargah is a man known as Shaul Hamid, and he's said to have come to Tamil Nadu in the 16th century, actually from North India, from a place called Manikpur, which is close to Prayag in Uttar Pradesh. The Dargah has a long history of patronage by the local rulers, the Tanjavur Nayakas, later the Maratha kingdom in Tanjavur, but interestingly enough, also by the Dutch. So, for example, the little mandapa you see here in the courtyard, it's called the Pier Mandapa, that has an inscription that identifies it as a place that had been funded by local Dutch East India Company officials. Now, one very interesting thing about the Nagur Dargah are its minarets. If you see in the background, you see that this is one of 5 minarets of the Dargah. And you see this is a very, very unusual style of architecture, I would say, for any Indian building. Now, my argument, I'm coming a little bit out on a limb here, but my theory in this is that this architectural style possibly is a continuation of local Buddhist traditions. And this, you see in the picture here, on the one hand side, you see the largest of the minarets of the Nagur Dargah, which was actually funded by the Maratha dynasty in Tanjavur. And on the right-hand side, you see one of the most famous pagodas in China, the Great Goose Pagoda in Xi'an. And you can see there is a recognizable similarity between the two buildings. So much so that whenever I show pictures of the Nagore Dargah to colleagues who work on China, I don't even have to tell them anything. They look at it and they say, this looks Chinese, right? Now, the interesting thing is what we had in Nagapatnam till the 19th century, till the British in the 19th century blew it up, was a place called the China Pagoda or the China Tower. And this is generally assumed to have been a ruin, a part of what was probably a Buddhist monastery complex. And you see the picture on the right-hand side. We fortunately have a few illustrations of this China Tower. And you see it on the right-hand side. This is an 18th century illustration, which was made by a Dutch painter. You can see the sort of similarity to these minaret structures. And in the early 19th century, we still have a British manual for navigation, which tells people navigation points along the coast. So when you go with your ship along the coast of India, and it says in that area of Nagapatnam, it says the first point you navigate by is a place called the Black Pagoda, which probably was this China Tower. And then he says a little bit further on, you will see the White Pagoda, and that is probably the Nagore Dargah. So even in the early 19th century, the British still recognized sort of the similarity between these two structures. And most likely this points to the fact that here a local Buddhist community converted to Islam, but then started or kept on building a sacred structure in a similar style to what they were used to. Now, the Nagore Dargah is very closely connected to the maritime history of Tamil Nadu, and that is especially because the saint is seen as a patron saint for all seafarers, no matter whether they are actually people who operate ships or whether you're just a passenger on a ship. There's a very famous legend that he saved a Dutch trading ship from sea wreck, and over the time of the colonial period, branch shrines of the Nagore Dargah have been formed in places such as Singapore, Penang, and Yangon in Southeast Asia, whereas indentured Hindu laborers brought the veneration of the saint to islands as far away as Mauritius, Réunion, and then the French Antilles in the Caribbean, where in many Hindu temples you have that saint as venerated as a deity. And to this day, the Nagore Dargah is a site of pilgrimage for Hindus and Muslims. Now, in that period also is we find the first evidence for something that is very, very close to my own heart, and that is the development of a very voluminous Islamic literature in Tamil language. And I will speak about this topic, I think in 3 weeks' time on the 11th of July, also at Khaki Labs. So if you are interested in this, feel free to join then also. So I'll give you just a very brief introduction to this. The first Islamic text that we actually have in Tamil language is a poem called the Ayra Masala Puranam, or the Legend of the Thousand Questions, which narrates how the Prophet Muhammad was met by a Jewish tribal chieftain who asked him supposedly 1,000 questions. In the poem, it's just about a bit more than 300, I think. And after hearing the Prophet answer these questions, acknowledged that the Prophet truly was a prophet and converted with his followers to Islam. This was written in the year 1572, 1573. And from this point onwards, we have a very rich development of literature, which includes, on the one side, something you might call courtly epics, so poems labeled as kavya or puranam in Tamil, as well as lyric poetry about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, about other prophets, about saints, and basically the praise of these figures. In addition, you have something that is very often called Sufi poetry. But if you are used to the Sufi poetry of North India, beware, this is a very, very different kind of poetry. It actually sounds much more than local Hindu Shaiva poems. And these are poems about what you could call esoteric knowledge of things that supposedly would get you closer to salvation. And thirdly, we have a development of a theological prose literature, which very often is written in Tamil, but in the Arabic script and in an Arabic version of the Arabic script that is adapted for writing Tamil, which is sometimes called Arab Tamil or Arabi. And you see an example of that here from a manuscript from the late 18th century on the left-hand side. You see this is a translation actually of an Arabic text, which was written by the same author. So the same person in South India wrote the Arabic text and then translated it himself into Tamil. And you can see the red part are the Arabic parts and the black part is the Tamil translation. On the other side, you see an example of a Tamil palm leaf manuscript, and this is also very interesting. This is a manuscript kept in the National Library of France in Paris, and it's a manuscript that actually contains what we would consider a Hindu text about a local deity called Madurai Veeran. But at the beginning of the manuscript, you find the Muslim basmala, the phrase Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So we can see that this manuscript was actually written by a Muslim scribe who used this formula at the beginning of the manuscript to call for the blessings of God before he started writing this text. What is very important to understand is that this literature is not really something directed at the common person. These are very much elite texts which require a lot of knowledge and understanding to decode. And in many ways, these were more expressions of the elite among Tamil Muslims who were trying to project their wealth into wider society by funding these poems and then having them publicly recited. And the basis for this literary patronage is really provided by the fact that in the period from the 16th to the 18th century, we really have something of a golden age of Tamil Muslim trade. Many of the coastal towns where Muslims settled were sort of half autonomous. They could more or less administer themselves and had only very little interference from the local rulers. And in this period, we see a large extension of trade networks of Tamil Muslims into Southeast Asia, despite European competition, and sometimes riding even on the European competition. So one of the very interesting things is that Tamil Muslims actually exploited the fact that there was a Danish settlement on the Tamil coast. It's a place called Tarangambadi or Trankebar. And the Danes didn't really have that much power to invest a lot of money into this port. So what happened was a sort of collaboration between the few Danish traders who were there and the Tamil Muslims who were all around them, who would actually do trade for the Danes under their flag. But because the other European powers like the British and the Dutch would be tolerant towards the Danish as trading partners. So they charged less customs and so on. It was of profit for the Tamil Muslims to fly under the Danish flag. And it was of profit for the Danes who didn't have the manpower to actually do more trade. And this went so far that we have letters by rulers from Southeast Asia, the sultans of Kedah, to the Danish king written in Tamil language. In many parts along the coast, but also in many parts of what is now Malaysia and Indonesia, we can see in this period how Tamil Muslims become very central to the court as bankers and as royal merchants for various rulers. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Just very briefly, there's also in this period, despite the fact that these are all kingdoms at this time, the Madurai Nayakas, Tanjavur Nayakas, and so on, who are by modern standard Hindu kingdoms, we do find a lot of Muslims in their armies. So the Dutch regularly comment on the fact that, for example, the cavalry of the Madurai Nayakas consisted almost exclusively of Muslims. So Muslims played a great role within local smaller South Indian states in that period. And the best example of that is provided by a group of people who are known as the Periatambis. So a particularly close connection comes up between Muslim merchants and the kingdom of Ramnath that is at the extreme tip of that peninsula that juts out towards Rameshwaram and controlling the Rameshwaram temple. And because of their control of that area, the dynasty is generally known as the Setupatis, as the lords of the bridge, referring, of course, to the Ram Setu over to Sri Lanka. So there is really a symbiosis between the kings of Ramnath who require a lot of financial input. They require money, and they get that money from the Muslim traders of the region. And in turn, they support those Muslim traders against especially the Dutch East India Company, who is constantly trying to gain total monopoly and control of the trade that passes through the region. So the kings of Ramnad and the Muslims are really very much supporting each other to keep the Dutch out. And this leads at one point to the fact that the kings recognize the leader of the local Muslim community by the title of Periyatambi Marakayar. So the name Periyatambi refers to the eldest younger brother of a family. So to say the second son of the family. And you can see the oldest son is the king. And the leader of the Muslim community is his second brother, his first younger brother, expressed in that title of Periyatambi. And we have four different individuals around the year 1700 which bore that title, as well as a lot of other titles. And one of them, Karupara Kavalar, which you can translate as something like Guardians of the Coast, is actually the title that inspired the title for my talk today. The most important of these Periyatambis, the second Periyatambi, is a man called Sedakadi. And he is very famous in Tamil literature as a literary patron. There's a famous verse about him written by a Hindu poet, which says that the poet wanted to come and meet Sedakadi because he was famous for his liberality and the money he would give to poets. But when he reached Ramnad, Sedakadi had just passed away. And in his anguish, the poet comes to the graveside of Sedakadi and starts reciting the poem that we are just reading. And as he recites it, a hand comes out of the grave with a bag of gold, which he hands to the poet. So Sedakadi is a very famous personality, and he's famous not only for literature, but also for his architectural support. The Friday Mosque of Kirakarai that you see on the left-hand side was apparently built at his behest. And you can see the very striking architectural style, which is very similar to local temple styles. And the story locally is that Sedakadi actually approached the king, who was building the huge corridors of the Rameshwaram temple at that time, and requested that some of the pillars which were fashioned by that workshop would be instead sent to Kirakarai to build this new mosque. And the king, knowing that he was very closely connected to the Muslim community, happily obliged. And even after 1710, the title of Periyatambi was discontinued because the Dutch had developed such an allergy to that title that they put a lot of pressure on the kings not to appoint a new Periyatambi. But that same family remained powerful in the kingdom of Ramnad until at least the 1730s. And there's another man called Labai Nainar, who was Sedakadi's grandnephew, who similarly, again, is a big patron of literature. I jump in the interest of time over this now and quickly want to come to the colonial period. In the 19th century, Tamil-speaking Muslims almost everywhere have come under British rule. In India, this is the time when a common Tamil national identity develops, and in a sense, Muslims develop into that. And they retain much of their importance for the local economy as traders and shopkeepers. Across the Park Strait in Ceylon, the exact opposite story unfolds. Here, Muslims for a long time get informally represented by non-Muslim Tamils, but the Muslim elites grow unhappy about that, especially since they do not identify as Tamil in Ceylon. And they oppose this arrangement and ultimately get recognized by the British as a separate community, which is nowadays known simply as Muslims or Moors in the Ceylon context. Whereas in Malaya, Muslims maintain a very close link both to non-Muslim Indians as well to other Muslim communities in British Malaya, which then, in a sense, comes apart with the development of local nationalisms. And in a sense, this is the last thing I want to talk about, namely the presence of that Tamil Muslim community in colonial Southeast Asia. So the colonial period had some negative things for Tamil Muslims and it had some positive things. The negative things was that Tamil Muslims at one point stopped being able to compete with European traders. They cannot compete with steamships. They cannot compete with the sort of international trade that happens at that time. But they actually turn out to be quite adept at shifting their interests. And instead of overseas shipping, they start operating lightermen and boats, which are very much needed in the harbors of Singapore or Penang. They also shift from transoceanic trade to retail trade and shopkeeping, so much so that they are a fixture in many of the colonial port cities of Southeast Asia because they are among the most important shopkeepers in these cities, together with people who come from China at the same time. So they are better able, actually, in this period to consolidate their presence in Southeast Asia. Transoceanic laws, now think about it, this is now suddenly all the British Empire. It more or less operates with a common legal system. And that makes it so much easier for you if you're settled in India to keep control of your property in a place like Singapore or in a place like Yangon. So this actually slowly now allows these Tamil Muslim traders from these coastal cities of Southeast Asia to extend inland into Burma, into Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and open shops and retail trade in these areas. And any of you, for example, who has ever gone to Laos, Laos has a minuscule Muslim community. But when you go to the Friday mosque of the capital of Vientiane, you will see there's a signboard in 4 languages pointing the way to that mosque. And one of the languages on that signboard is Tamil. So in interior Southeast Asia, you suddenly have this local Indian Muslim community. They're very central also in the creation of the architectural landscape of colonial cities. So some of the oldest mosques in Singapore or Yangon or even in Saigon in Vietnam were actually built by Tamil Muslims and not by local Muslim communities. And finally, they are also the creators in these areas of a Tamil press, of Tamil newspapers, and Tamil publications that were brought out in these countries. So they're very much pioneers in extending the Tamil language into countries such as Singapore. At the same time, they maintain close connections to local populations through intermarriage. And this ultimately leads to a situation by the 1920s where they are caught up between nationalisms, where on the one side, the Malays say, you are Indians. And the Indians say, oh, you're Muslims, you're more with the Malays. So you are somehow in between those two communities, which earlier you actually made your living of bridging. And now you are somehow having to balance that bridge and having to walk a little bit the tightrope between those two communities. And that is a little bit the tragedy of what happens to these Tamil Muslim communities, who are still very much there and very much a part of the life of these countries. Very briefly to the present day, many of you, I started this with saying most of you will probably not associate Tamil Nadu with Islam and Muslims. And yet, all of you, I suspect, will know the 2 individuals on the side here who are, after all, Tamil Muslims. So, in fact, Tamil Muslims still are very much a vivid community and a vibrant community with a generally good economic standing within Tamil Nadu. I've already mentioned several times a very uneven distribution within the state. But one thing which I always find important to point out about Tamil Muslims, because many people find that surprising, is the very high degree of literacy of Tamil Muslims. So in 2001, that's the only year for which I have exact dates, Tamil Nadu Muslims actually were not only above average in the Indian context with their literacy rates, but they were actually more literate than the state of Tamil Nadu as a whole. So this is a very, very, very literate community, which of course is connected to the fact that there has been historically this very strong involvement with trade, and traders need at least a little bit of literacy in order to be able to keep their books. They also, as you can see with the example of President Kalam and A.R. Rahman, they're very much participating both in the political and the cultural landscape of the state. If any of you had a look at the recent elections in Tamil Nadu, there is no major party in that state that didn't field Muslim candidates. And a good number of them also were elected from whether it be Vijay's party or whether it be the DMK or the ADMK. So Muslims have a relatively, especially compared to many other parts of India, relatively good integration into the wider state of Tamil Nadu. And with this, I would like to thank you so much for your attention, for having me today, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Well, Dr. Shaka, thank you so much. That was really wonderful, enlightening. Um, so my question really first one was when did Tamil Muslim as a coherent category actually start getting used? Is it and by whom? I mean, is it a colonial construct? And I guess the second part of that question that I had was when Islam arrived, it arrived with kind of a universal message, right? That transcended
Mm,
birth and lineage and stuff. Yet it took root in a society that was structured by caste, right? So in the case of the Tamil Muslims, did religion overcome caste, or did caste simply sort of reinvent itself in a different form?
mm. These are two very, very fantastic questions. Um, the first one is Tamil Muslim is a term that comes up slowly in the course of the 19th century. And it is something which at the beginning strikes people as strange. So we actually have a reader's letter in a newspaper in Singapore in 1887 who said, "What is that supposed to mean? Mohammedan Tamils." And the editor says to him, "It's really a shame that you don't know that people from other communities," he uses the word prajatiyar, the people from a prajati, they call uh, Bengali Mohammedans, any Bengali speaking Muslim, they call Mohammedan Bengalis, and any Tamil speaking Muslim, they call Mohammedan Tamils. And how is it that you don't know that? But he doesn't say we do this, he says others are doing that. And indeed, this is something that took a while. And this is partly due to the fact, which many people nowadays are not aware of anymore, that the word Tamirar in Tamil, so Tamilian, actually referred to caste and to a particular section of the caste hierarchy, specifically those castes who were not Brahmin, but who could enter temples. These were called Tamirar. And in the early modern period, the word is used by both Muslims and Christians to refer to Hindu Tamilians. So you find Jesuit texts that divide the world into, as people in Europe did at that time, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and pagans. And instead of pagan, in the Tamil translation, they will write Tamirar. Right? So that was actually the problem, that people weren't used to use the word Tamirar as something that united everyone who spoke the language. That happened only in the course of the early 20th century. But interestingly enough, in India, the Muslims who spoke Tamil came to accept that they are Tamilians, whereas in Sri Lanka, they rejected it. And this, to this day, leads to conflict. I've seen this myself. So if in Sri Lanka you say Tamil Muslims, people will shout at you, right? Whereas I had it in Chennai on the road. I once talked to a gentleman who was a Muslim. And I pointed this out that this is the case in Sri Lanka. He flatly denied it. He said, "No, no, how can that be? We are Tamils, right? How?" So this is indeed a relatively recent thing, but this is due to the fact that the idea of a Tamil nation built on a unified language is itself a modern idea. Now, this brings us to the whole question of caste, and this is very, very interesting. Um, so, yes, I would say two things. There is, of course, there are hierarchies within Tamil Muslims. I, from my side, do not consider these hierarchies to be of the same type as caste. Some other people will disagree with me and will say, no, actually, we can distinguish castes. And I would say this to a certain degree, it's an academic debate because everyone will agree that the kind of imbalances in the system are nowhere near as strong as on the Hindu side. And interestingly enough, also in contrast, say, to the Tamil Christians, where you can often very clearly tell what caste they are. They will tell you themselves, we are Christian Nadars, we are Christian Veladars, and so on and so forth, right? But among Muslims, you can at no point really very clearly say, okay, these people belong to that caste earlier. But one interesting thing is that in the 17th century, well into the 19th century, Muslims refer to themselves as a jati. So being a Muslim is a kind of caste, right? So instead of being seen as a religion, that somehow stands outside the whole thing because you're not Hindu. You're part of the local society, and like everyone else, you have a jati, and that jati is called Muslim. So that is an interesting reinvention, I would say, of the notion of caste, where Muslims themselves start seeing themselves as a separate caste.
Interesting. So Lakshmi Ramanan says, thank you for your fascinating talk. I hailed from a village in Vellore district, and my grandparents lived in Valaja, a large Muslim population taluk that I visited every year for months growing up. Um, so IC says, would you say that Sunni belief and practices in Arabic language, literary culture are pronounced in Tamil Muslim communities, and that the communities in the Deccan in Karnataka and Telangana have more Persianate influences? Also, thank you for linking Southeast Asia. It explains why the Indonesian national emblem combines a Tamil word with both Sanskrit and Pali.
Yeah, the question of the Sunni part, that is interesting. Because what we do see, as you mentioned correctly, the Deccan not only has a strong Persianate element, but they do at one point also have a very strong Shia element, which is very deliberately chosen partly against the Mughals, because the Mughals are seen as the enemies, and the Shia Safavid dynasty is over in Iran, and you sort of try to get the Mughals in the middle. Um, Now, the interesting thing is, we have a couple of poems, mostly late 17th, early 18th century, all of them written in Madurai, um, which seem on the surface to be very Shia. They talk about the Battle of Karbala, they talk about the glories of Ali, and so on. But they also remain within the Sunni context in the sense that all the early four caliphs are being praised. There's no denouncement of the first three caliphs, and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of Shia impact, which comes especially inland and in Madurai, probably through the army, because as I said, Vijayanagara already has a relatively large Muslim part of the army. And many of these people came from the Deccan, and quite a lot of them were probably Shia. So, within the context of Madurai, where many of the Muslim neighborhoods, and we can really see that in these poems because these neighborhoods are mentioned, were probably neighborhoods where people connected to the army lived. We see this impact from Persian poetry and a more Shia inflected kind of piety. That is there, but it never turns into a full fledged self identification as Shia. And with the time, as the influence of Shia kingdoms grows weaker, the people, even though these cultural elements remain, for example, also in Muharram celebrations, which are very big and which are exported actually by Tamil Muslims to places such as Singapore. These are the kind of Sunni Muharram celebrations, which are more like a carnival. They are not mourning, they are actually celebrating. So over time, the identity gets shaped as a Sunni identity. And the vast majority of Tamil Muslims nowadays will say we are Sunnis. So the only Shias I know are people who actually became Shia in response to the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978. Um, but yeah, there is a connection with
Okay.
these Dakni.
Okay. There's a question from Vidya. Is there evidence that Muslim communities were established in Kerala earlier than in Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu? If so, to what extent did the subsequent spread of Islam into Tamil Nadu draw upon existing Muslim networks and communities in Kerala? For example, do groups such as the Labes or Marakers have historical connections to or origins influenced by Muslim communities on the Malabar coast?
This is a very good question. Yeah, I would say the evidence for Kerala is a bit earlier, and that is unsurprising given the simple ease with which you can reach Kerala in opposition to Sri Lanka and then also the East Coast. And why go further east than you have to if you're a trader? If you can get everything you want in Kollam or in Calicut, you wouldn't be going all around the coast. Um, it makes no sense, right? So the clear evidence for Kerala is a bit earlier. Though I have to say, unfortunately or fortunately, there are lots of legends, and many of them, I don't want to denounce them as untrue, like when the first mosque was founded and so on and so forth. But whether they are true or not is not always clear. But in case of Kerala, it's a little bit clearer that there were Muslims on the coast earlier than they were on the East Coast. However, in terms of the development of a local Muslim community that was not regularly replenished from the Middle East, I would say that happens about the same time in both places. And there are shared aspects of the culture. So, for example, the Malayalam Islamic literature, it develops from the early 17th century onwards, and that draws actually on the Tamil one, which had a somewhat higher prestige. And there are connections in terms of course, trade connections. So the title Marakar is used on the Malabar coast, it is used on the Tamil coast. I wouldn't call it a community prior to the fact when the British started calling it as a community. I would say Marakar is actually the local translation of the Persian title Nakhoda. So the ship owner, ship captain, ship lord, literally. So there are definitely connections, and the communities share a lot, but they're not identical. There are differences as well between the Malabar and especially the North Malabar communities and the Tamil Nadu side.
Anwar, you wanted to ask a question. Can you unmute yourself and ask the question? In the meantime, maybe I'll ask a question that that Vidya had essentially. And she asks, do the Tamil-speaking Moors of Sri Lanka trace their origins to Africa, as the term Moor might suggest, or are their roots primarily linked to an Arab trading communities from regions such as Yemen?
The latter. I mean, the story that Sri Lankan Moors will tell and the story that Tamil Muslims tell about their links to the Middle East are virtually identical. And it's always been the attempt to say, no, actually, you come from Tamil Nadu, by those in Sri Lanka who want to say that the Moors are actually Tamils. The word Moors comes from the Europeans. The Europeans, at one point in Western Europe, every Muslim was referred to as a Moor. And as a result, both the Portuguese and the Dutch refer to Muslims as Moors. And that's stuck. That is basically all. So there's no connection to Africa in any way that I'm aware of. I mean, maybe there were, but then it wouldn't have been to the part of Africa where the Moors came from, which is Mauritania, which is the northwest. It would have been to East Africa.
True. Someone called iPhone, they haven't put their name in, says your presentation is more towards Shafi Madhab people mainly on the coastal side. What about the Hanafi Madhab people who are mainly located on the land side?
Mhm. This is very good that you asked that. I'm talking about the maritime history, and the tendency then is also to focus on the coastal sites where the Shafi people live. But very good that you ask it because I really have to emphasize this. The inland people have a full participation in that maritime trade, both because they help in the distribution of goods from the coast inland, but especially also in the colonial period, we see a very, very interesting development that many people from inland towns, especially in the Kaveri Delta, they come over to places like Penang and Singapore, and they get involved in businesses that you wouldn't have expected them to do. So they get involved in this operation of cargo boats, right? So you would think they're an inland community, they will not get involved with maritime things, but quite the contrary. They are involved with the trade in Southeast Asia as well. Some of you may have seen, because it went around the last few weeks in social media, there was this post, the Router Princess of Malacca. So Router is nowadays generally seen like a community term for the Hanafi inland communities. And I haven't referred to that for a very simple reason, namely that the actual evidence of whether the lady in question was even a Tamil Muslim is unclear. We know they were Indians, but they may have been Gujaratis, they may have been Tamils, they may have been Hanafi, they may have been Shafi. We don't know much about them. So the community has adopted them to a certain degree, and I don't want to say it's impossible. So just in case if you're interested why I didn't refer to that, it's because as a historian, I tend to be conservative with evidence. But yes, the inland people are as much part of that maritime connection as are the coastal people. And it's very good that you point this out. And much of the literature that I have referred to is actually also written in inland places such as Madurai.
Okay. I mean, since you touched upon this topic of maritime trade, the question that comes to mind is, see, through most of history, we learn, most of the history we learn is told kind of through the stories of kings and emperors and wars and political boundaries. But, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century Tamil Muslim merchant probably viewed the world very differently, right? I mean, life would have revolved around ports, trade routes, monsoon winds, business relationships, and so on. All of it sort of spread across the Indian Ocean. So if we were to look at, if we were to see Asia through that trader's eyes rather than those of a ruler, what would that map look like? I mean, which places would be at the center of his world, and what might he have considered more important than kingdoms and borders?
I think he would have considered most things more important than kingdoms and borders. And especially you have to remember that in those days, borders in any case didn't exist in the way that we know them now, right? Nowadays, you want to cross a border, you need a passport, you get checked, etc. All of that didn't happen, and certainly not. You just went onto your boat and you went over to the other side and hoped that people would allow you to land in their port. And if they banned you from landing, you would go to the next port and land, right? So yeah, that world would have looked very different. Of course, the traders would keep in mind kingdoms because kings were fickle creatures. They were important for trade. They could guarantee trade. They could protect traders. They could encourage trade, but they could also do the opposite. They could invade. They could plunder. So of course, you had to keep all your kings in mind and your options open. Usually, at least for this particular community or these particular people, I think they would have a sort of double view of the world. They had usually a place in India where they were born, and they had usually one place along the coast in Southeast Asia where they had their major operations center. And in many cases, we know they would have a wife in each of these places. So, because you don't have the law to protect your property, but you can have a wife to protect your property. And there's a very interesting thing. This is again the Shafis on the coast who do that. They have a tendency to pass the real estate, so houses and real estate, in the female line, because men are constantly on the move. The women are the one who stay in place. And so real estate makes so much more sense to be passed along on the women's side. And we do have, for example, Malacca is under Dutch rule from the late 17th century onwards. So if you look at, this is one thing I'm currently working on, if you look at the archives of the Dutch in Malacca, you find actually Tamil Muslim traders, who are called Moors by the Dutch, making wills saying, if I pass away, half of my property is to go to my wife in Tarangambadi, and half of my property is going to my wife in Malacca. So, and this is also how you make connections with the other communities, how you gain roots in the local society to be able to talk to producers, to other traders. And that is exactly, this relationship is the important part. So the kings are there. You have to take cognizance of them. You have to be careful with them. There can be opportunities, but you will also be wary of the kings. And I think to a certain degree, this is exactly what made the Tamil Muslims gel to a certain degree, even though they were big competitors and didn't like each other, with the Europeans. Because in a sense, the European trading companies were similar kind of creatures. They were merchants who, yeah, had a king back or in the case of the Dutch, they had a republic back in Europe, but locally they were predominantly a group of merchants that tried to shore up their profits. So I think it's a very, very different way to look at the map. You look at trade goods, you look at markets, you look at, in a sense, a much larger canvas in which kings are just one important factor among many.
Yeah. So I just want to touch upon something you just talked about, which is so the European colonial powers have sort of often portrayed themselves as the architects of global trade in some ways. From your research, I mean, did Portuguese, Dutch, British expansion, did they create sort of entirely new commercial systems, or did they kind of largely insert themselves into networks that were sophisticated and already existed by folks like the Muslim, the community, the Muslim Tamil community.
The truth is somewhere in the middle. So, and one also has to see that the Europeans act differently. So the Portuguese still act very much with this empire idea, right? They are extending the Estado da India. They're extending the Portuguese state. And they have a viceroyalty and I don't know what. The Northern Europeans operate with these trading companies, and that is a different game already in comparison to the Portuguese. So the Europeans introduce a lot of new stuff. The way they introduce customs, they try to monopolize trade, they build forts at strategic locations. That is why the Setupati kings become important, because the Dutch want to build a fort on Rameswaram Island. And if they had managed that, they would have had total control of all the trade that passes from the Arabian Sea into the Bay of Bengal. And the Setupatis and the local Muslim community do everything to prevent that. And the Setupatis keep on saying to the Dutch, you can't do that. This island is off limits for anyone but Hindus, right? This is our temple and we won't allow you to come to that island. Yeah. But at the very same time, of course, the Europeans see where traders are. They need those Asian traders. Stanford Raffles, first when he founded Singapore, or the modern port of Singapore, one of the things he did very early was to suggest we need to keep the Strait of Malacca free of pirates, because what he envisioned was not predominantly trade from China. He wanted the people from Tamil Nadu to come to Singapore. And he said currently, because there are so many pirates, they go only up to Penang. So in order for being able to attract these people to my new port, I need the straits cleared out of pirates. So you can see the British know that these networks are there, and they are, how to put it, they are very appreciative and yet very angry about them. So there was a British merchant called Thomas Bowery in the late 17th century, and he had all reason to hate Tamil Muslims because they kept him imprisoned in one of their ports for, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, and nobody did anything. The East India Company didn't do anything. The Nawabs of Arcot didn't do anything. He was just imprisoned. And he comes back to England and writes an account of the Bay of countries around the Bay of Bengal. And in this account, he is full of bile against Tamil Muslims. But in that, he actually acknowledges how successful they are. He says, these people are among the best, what he calls linguists that I've seen. They learn so many languages and they go into every kingdom. And what do? They go to the local merchants and they go to the king and they tell these people how much the goods that we English people buy in one port, how much we have paid for them, because they know it. And by that, they ruin our prices. Right? So he was very much telling the EIC, you have to get rid of these people. They are really a nuisance for us. But in that, he actually recognizes how widespread these networks are and how much intelligence was there along these networks of knowing, okay, in this port, they would have paid this amount of money for this particular good. So then I can tell my partner in the other port, you don't give them more than this amount, because otherwise they're ripping you off, right?
Interesting. So I'm going to close. I have one final question that really goes back to the opening comment you made, which is given how thoroughly maritime and globally connected this history is that you just shared with us, why does the popular memory of Tamil Nadu still center almost entirely on temples and sort of land-based Hindu kings? I mean, is
Mm.
that a real historical imbalance? Is it a product of which archives and languages historians have chosen, or is it just plain simple politics?
No, it's very much the former. It is also politics, but I do think, I mean, Tamil Nadu has been a state that has also been sometimes very critical of precisely that heritage. So I don't think that is the political side is so much the reason. It's really been a question of number one, what do you focus on? And one of the things that you focus on has been the Chora Pandya sort of period and empires, where we see Muslims start coming in, but they are not yet really that important in that period. Now, this whole period of the 15th to 18th century has in Tamil Nadu history tended to be a little bit jumped over, being the period when Tamil Nadu was under the rule of foreign dynasties, of Telugu dynasties, of Marathi dynasties, of the Mughals. So, as a result, I think part of that fault for overlooking this history has to do with the fact that this history has not happens in a period that tends to get overlooked in general in Tamil Nadu history.
Okay. I think Anwar, are you with us?
Yeah.
You can
Can
unmute
you
and
hear
ask your
me?
question, please.
Yes, we
Yeah,
Yes.
can hear you.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Torsten. As usual, it's a delight listening to you. Um, Quite a new thing that I learned. And my question is, one thing I understood during a lecture is you studiously avoided the Kerala coast till the person before, I think Lakshmi Raman or somebody asked a question. And because when you're saying about the antiquity and all that evidences, you omitted out the Terisapalli copper plates of 9th century, which has Arabic names and all that, which talks about the presence of Muslims and but what I found interesting was that of late, I mean, this is my thinking. The other point that you made that was neither Persian or Urdu has made a deep impact on. I do agree. Yes, Urdu is a very late development, 19th century. But just wondering because the Tersapalli copper plate itself, it's basically given to Persian Christians, Christians coming from the Persian church. And then I realized that the church, initially Christianity here itself was influenced by the Persian church considerably. And many of them are Persian traders. And then when you see Marco Polo is also, he's talking about the ships that are coming to the western coast, Kyle and all that. Many of them are carrying horses from Persian ports. And now also there's one other, again, the Kerala coast you avoided. Abdur Rahman comes from, this, he bears a message in 15th century before the Portuguese came. I think 13th, 14th or 15th century, he comes to the Calicut Zamorin carrying a message that henceforth, you can have the khutbah in the name of the king of, one of the Persian kings, Khanate, we can. So this connection, I think, with Persia has been there for quite a while till the Portuguese disrupted the whole connection. That's what I understand. And also looking at, later poets, like, I mean, you also said they're linguists and all that, like Kunangudi Mastan Sahib. It's 19th century. So he also, uses, he also knew Persian. And so because now I'm looking at now that the time of the Muharram, and I've been doing this Muharram walks here in Chennai, and digging into it, I've started realizing that, across Tamil Nadu, there is in southern Tamil Nadu, in places like Ramanathapuram, where there are no Urdu-speaking Muslims, villages, Muharram is observed by non-Muslims, not Muslims, but non-Muslims. Muslims over a period of time, I think with Periyar, they started giving up, Tamil Muslims, started giving up Muharram. But that's there. So I was just wondering whether till 15th century, Persian played a considerable influence on the Tamil Muslim community. Because some of the early literature also at that point of time has a kind of a Shia, the Hassan Hussein stories and all that. That's my question.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll make it as short as possible. So I deliberately avoided Kerala because there is a lot of talk about Kerala already. Kerala has justifiably recently got a lot of attention, and I think there are people far more suitable than I to talk about that subject. So I've indeed studiously avoided it, as you said, and that was for a reason. Of course, there are connections to Kerala, and there's a lot of interconnectivity, but I have avoided that here because I really wanted to get this part of the history out. As with regard to Persian, I really have to make a distinction between two things. There is a lot of connection, of course, with Iran, with Persian mercantile communities. As you say, a lot of the nautical vocabulary in Tamil is actually derived from Persian, right? So there is a trade connection with Persia that is clear and that continues for a very, very long time. The oldest Arabic tombstone that I know from Tamil Nadu, which dates from the year 1300, is the tombstone of a woman, and her father has a nisbah from a part of Iran which is on the Caspian Sea. So definitely there's a connection to Iran. Now, when I speak about Persian and Urdu in one go, I speak about the textual literary tradition of Persian because this is what many people know, many people are familiar with. And while a couple of Tamil Muslim authors obviously knew Persian, they did not, except for occasionally taking stories from Persian literature. If you compare Tamil with the way that, say, Urdu or Punjabi draw on Persian genres, on Persian ways of expression, on Persian aesthetics, that is something completely different. And this is basically what I'm talking about when I said Persian here. What I mean basically is the kind of culture that we associate with North Indian courts, which are heavily Persianized. Ghazals, for example, right, as a genre. That is what has actually not really made that much of an impact. Persians as Iranians as people, Persian-speaking people, Persian-speaking societies and so on, yes, absolutely. They are there. There are contacts, and the contacts continue throughout that period. And they are very important. So thank you for that comment. That is, and for allowing me to clarify this at this point.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a lot of appreciation for this, Dr. Tschacher. Nazneen says a big thank you for an extremely enlightening session. Lakshmi says, I'm looking forward to your next talk in July. Well, at Khaki, we often say that places reveal their stories when you learn to look at them differently. Dr. Tschacher, thank you. You've really helped us to do that nicely. I think you've shown us that the coastline of Tamil Nadu is not just a geographical edge. It's also part of a very vast maritime world that connected, people, ideas, faiths across, thousands of miles. So in rediscovering, I think, this history, we rediscovered kind of a reminder that the sea has actually not separated us from the world. It has actually connected us to it. So thank you, Dr. Tschacher, for helping us to see that history today with fresh eyes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.